I'm Karen Hoskin, the Executive Director of Coho US, and you all will see Karen Gimnig on the screen as well. She's the Associate Director. She and I are kind of tag teaming hosting this. So welcome everybody. So I would like to introduce, I can't see her while I'm talking, there she is, Yana Ludwig. Some of you may know her as My Quay. Yana has just a ton of community experience. She is currently on the board of FIC, lived in Dancing Rabbit Eco Village for a bazillion years and is now working on creating a new eco village in Wyoming. She's an author, writes quite regularly in the Communities magazine and has written a couple of books, and she's going to just give us an introduction on consensus. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Karen. And actually, we are landed. We actually have community property since last time I saw you. So I am broadcasting live from the Solidarity Collective in Laramie, Wyoming. So
nice. Congratulations.
Yes, yay. Okay, cool. So, so probably everybody who's doing these things is saying something at the beginning like, this is a tiny little piece of what we could talk about in this topic. And so that's true with this as well. Consensus is you know, sort of a lifelong adventure in terms of learning it and learning how to do it well and everything. And so I'm going to hit some highlights and hopefully not give you so much that you don't feel like you want to ask a question about those things. So I mostly want to go ahead and just do like a really brief overview of some highlights for how to make consensus be functional, and then want to preserve most of the time for us to be able to just talk. So the first thing that I want to say about consensus is that consensus is actually two different things that are related to each other. So one of them is that it is a decision-making system, you know, a way of making decisions where you do your best to take into account everybody's input into whatever the topic is and whatever the decision is. And that's what most people think of when they think about consensus. They think about, oh, how are we going to make decisions? We could do consensus. But consensus is actually a second thing as well. And that is that it is a cultural paradigm. And that's the part that I actually end up spending most of my energy on, because learning the mechanics of consensus is not actually that complicated. But learning how to actually create a culture and an environment where you're having conversations where people really truly are heard and really truly are taken into account is a much trickier thing. And that's the cultural side of things. And I actually do, a lot of my work is focused on articulating and helping groups get a handle on what exactly cooperative culture is, as opposed to the sort of competitive individualistic culture that almost all of us have been raised in here in North America. And if you want to get a snapshot, we're not going to do a lot with this on this call, I don't think, unless you all want to talk about this mostly, but there's a chart that looks like this. Can you see that? That is on my website. And so if you go to yanaludwig.net and the offerings page under group process, you'll be able to find this chart. And so that'll give you a sense of like what I'm talking about when I talk about cooperative culture. This chart's kind of a summary of what I mean by that. And it's the center column on that chart that is the interesting territory that I'm sort of working on promoting through the work that I do. And to put it into like a one phrase summary, cooperative culture is a culture that balances discernment with compassion and listening. And so and there's a whole bunch that goes into that, and there's relationships to our economic system and our political system and a whole bunch of other systems that we're all kind of embedded in that need to be shifted in order for us to get to that place where we're able to really functionally balance those two things out. So that's the first thing that I want to say about consensus, is that if you get the cultural stuff right, you can do decision making with just about any kind of actual system and have it be functional and have it work for people. The opposite thing isn't true. You can have a really slick system and like figure out exactly what your processes are, and if you're not attending to the cultural part of things, then you're probably going to bump into problems, because what you're doing is you're overlaying a system or a way of doing things on top of competitive dynamics and individualistic dynamics. And those are not what we want to be creating in community, but that's generally what we bring into community, are that kind of cultural programming. So, so that's the number one thing that when I'm working with groups around consensus, I'm looking at, like, what's your culture, and, you know, how is that actually working, and how can we actually work on fostering culture change in order to have better group process. So that said, as like the big background piece to how I do consensus stuff, I want to give you just a half a dozen pieces that are that I'm just going to say a quick thing about with each one, that actually go into then having a system that fosters consensus that really works. So the first one is that you've got to have articulated and widely known group values and purpose that you all have agreed upon. And the reason why that is critically important is that when you're in a decision-making process, what you want to be able to do is to go back to, okay, wait, what are we trying to do here? Like, ultimately, that's what you want to be able to go back to. And you have to have a sense of what that is. What are those values that you're trying to embody? What is the mission of your community? And then you can use that to help you have that discernment that I was talking about with the culture piece, so that you know, okay, so is this decision that we're about to make, is it really in alignment with our vision and mission and our values and who we're trying to be together, or not? And it becomes the sort of big picture arbiter of what is a good decision and what's not a good decision. And if you don't have that, it gets very difficult to have any kind of functional consensus process, because at that point it's kind of like, well, anything goes. Anybody can bring anything to the table if you don't have an agreement about what it is that you're actually trying to do together. And when you're in a state of everything goes, you get into that kind of individualistic thing, and you start getting people blocking things for really inappropriate reasons. So that brings me to the second thing, which I think very few groups do, which is, what is a valid block? Defining that, and how do you validate a block? So what's your process for figuring out whether something is actually in alignment with those group values and that group mission? What's your process for that? And what's your understanding of blocks, and like what's valid and what isn't valid? And so a lot of groups will just go like, if somebody says I block, then they're done. And it gets really frustrating when you're in that group, because literally if anybody can block for any reason, you're not likely to actually get anywhere with things. You want to have a clear sense of like what's okay and what's not okay in terms of blocking. So there's a classic example that's particularly apropos at this time of the year, which is, you know, say you have, you know, you're a community that doesn't have a particular dietary thing about, like, you know, we are a vegetarian community or a vegan community. And it gets close to Thanksgiving, and like somebody in your community who is a vegan protests serving turkey for Thanksgiving dinner. And if you don't have a sense of like, okay, so what's a legitimate block, that person can block that and can stop the community from serving turkey, even though you're not a vegan community. So if you're clear about what your values are, and this is kind of a silly example, but it's one that I think everybody can sort of grok, like, oh yeah, there's a lot of like, you know, deeply held personal convictions around dietary stuff. And that's not necessarily what your community is about. And so being able to respect people's individual takes on things, but also get clear about, okay, so what's this community about? And what's the box within which we're going to be operating together, and what other needs that we're going to be meeting for each other, and what things are outside of that box. And therefore, we're not going to actually let somebody stop a community process from moving forward based on things that are outside of that box. Okay, is this making sense so far? Just looking for a quick kind of scanning for like thumbs up or nods or something from folks. So, okay, great. All right, cool. So the third one is having a clear understanding of who is in the decision-making process and who is not in the decision-making process. So I know a lot of people were involved with the Occupy movement, which was a brilliant and amazing movement in many, many ways, and, you know, has affected our culture in a lot of really positive ways. And the consensus process in most Occupy groups was god-awful. And one of the biggest reasons was that anybody could show up with zero background, not having been vetted by anybody in the group, and suddenly be a full-on decision maker. And a lot of stuff that the Occupy movement tried to do got blocked and stopped because anybody could show up at any point. And if you were on your fourth conversation about something, it didn't matter if that person had missed all of that background stuff, they could come in and they could block a decision. And so it's really important that you're clear about who are the decision makers and at what point does the right, particularly to block something, but it could also be, you know, other rights that you give people as they're moving into the community. At what point do they have full rights as a decision maker? And do they need to get some training? Do they need to be oriented? Like what's the bar that you ask people to meet before you give them the full keys to the community decision making? Okay, so third one is having a clear sense of who is a member and who's not a member for the purposes of decision making. So number 4, which is probably obvious, but a lot of groups don't necessarily make sure this is happening, is having a clear and known process for how you make your decisions. Sometimes what will happen is that, you know, because the folks that have been there from the beginning, like they know it to the point where it's almost intuitive after you've been in it for a while. Sometimes you drop balls around actually orienting new folks into that process, and it just looks like a black box. It's like mysterious to folks who come in later who weren't necessarily there as you were developing your processes and are not necessarily getting a good orientation to the process as they come in. And this ends up having a lot of power dynamics embedded in it, and a lot of where some people have access to full decision-making power and some people don't, simply because they don't understand what's happening. And so it's important that your processes are known and that somebody is making sure that new folks who are coming into the group are getting a good orientation to those things. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to be missing a lot of people's capacity to really productively contribute, and it's fundamentally unfair on some level. So you've got to make sure that you're bringing new people along. So having a clear and known process. So the 5th one is neutral facilitation. So the facilitator role is a power role. You know, we don't often like to think of it that way, but that person actually does have a tremendous amount of potential influence over how a conversation goes and what kinds of decisions are getting made. And so if you have somebody who is facilitating a particular meeting who wants a particular outcome, that's a setup. And even if they are sterling in terms of their actual behavior as the facilitator, if people know that they wanted a certain thing to happen and that's what ended up happening, it sort of creates this, this environment of kind of like suspicion of like, was that really clean or was that not really clean, or was this person actually influencing things in some ways? And if you're not neutral, you probably will end up nudging it unconsciously in a certain direction. And so it's really important that the facilitator, the person who's running the meeting and is deciding where are we going with the conversation, what's next, are we ready to call for consensus, that that person doesn't have a dog in that particular fight, so to speak. You know, that they aren't really, you know, looking for a particular outcome. What they're looking for is that the group has a good process, has good conversations about the thing, that people are being heard in an even-handed way, and not that we're nudging it in any particular direction in terms of what the final outcome of that decision is. So that was number 5, and that was neutral facilitation. So the last one is one that we can talk about more if folks want to, and I can actually give you a little graph to explain this one. But I think one of the big mistakes that consensus groups make is about sequencing, which sounds like sort of a geeky little, you know, nitpicky detail in some ways, but it's actually really critically important. So a lot of groups say, you can put anything on the agenda, but you have to come with a proposal in order to get something on the agenda. We want to know what you want us to do about it before we'll be willing to talk about it. And I think that is absolutely a setup for consensus process not working well. Because if you don't know what other people think needs to be taken into account. What you don't know if other folks even think this is something we should be talking about. And you come in with a ready-made proposal. What you've basically said is, I've already drawn the box within which we can talk. We can talk about this proposal and this specific approach to things, but we're not necessarily going to be able to have the kind of creative juice. The consensus is actually really beautiful at creating for groups when it is a functional process where you get lots of different input into what do we need to take into account, what does this proposal need to do, and only then do you start thinking about proposals. So you make sure everybody's input is in there about what a proposal needs to do before you start making proposals. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around facilitators, making sure that they are keeping us in the kind of conversation that we're having right now. So you want that initial conversation to be very expansive. Like, that's the point where really anything goes, and where you want to get what's on people's mind about this topic or about this problem that we're trying to solve. And then you go ahead and go, okay, so now that we know what's on people's minds, let's think about this solution making through those lenses. And that makes it so that everybody's in the room from the get-go, instead of somebody walking in the room, hearing a proposal that they absolutely hate, and setting up a dynamic where you're going to be arguing about a specific solution when maybe that's not even what you should be talking about. You should be talking about, like, where do we need to go? What do we need to take into account? And what's important about this topic to people before you actually launch into decision making. Because when you get into decision making, then it's contractive. You're trying to converge on a particular answer. And so it's very different energy. The expansive, get everybody's input, is really different energy from the contractive, okay, now what are we going to do phase. And when you mix those two things together, things get really rough as a group. Okay, so that was my total speed, one big point and 6 little points. Yeah, there's a lot more to say. I'm interested though in knowing what you all want to talk about and what you want me to say more about. So.
Yana, I don't know if you saw Henning's question. Can you comment on the implications to consensus of not having good facilitators?
Yeah, I can. So to me, the most important thing goes back to that thing that I was saying at the beginning about how this is a big cultural paradigm shift. And, what the job of a facilitator is at the beginning of a group working together, and before the group is actually like really sunk into that cooperative culture thing, is to keep things cooperative. To sort of head off those dynamics where things get competitive and get funky, where people want to get into like arguing with each other and going back and forth about things. That's not productive, and that's our competitive training. And that's where we spend a lot of time in our meetings typically. So the facilitator's job is really being able to help the group find what are the commonalities and where are the places where this thing that you're saying over here actually has a connection to this other thing over here that isn't a argumentative connection, but actually is a strengthening connection. So a lot of times when we get into disagreements about, well, not even disagreements, oftentimes, like if I say, I want us to do X, and somebody says, I want us to do Y, even if those two things are not directly in competition with each other, we often respond as if we've just been disagreed with. And the facilitator's job is to make sure that we're not going there, that we're going like, okay, X is interesting and Y is interesting. What happens if we like put those together in some way? And so until the group gets really good at actually cooperating with each other and finding those bridges for themselves, the facilitator is really critically important. Once a group gets there, you don't necessarily need a facilitator, but it takes a while. I mean, this is like multiple years of working together and really getting into this cooperative groove before you can sort of fly without a facilitator and have that actually work well. Yeah, so I'd say that's, they're the guardian of the process when it comes down to it. And that's why you want them to be neutral.
There's a question about, can you talk about consensus and other versions of it, such as modified consensus?
Sure. Well, this is part of what I was saying about, like, I think that if you get the cultural stuff right, the specific system that you choose is not necessarily that critical. Like, I think you can do consensus, you can do consensus -1, you can do sociocracy. Like, there's a lot of variations on the theme of sort of what's starting to be called consent-based decision-making systems. And none of them are going to work very well if you're not learning how to be cooperative. And all of them can work pretty well if you are. I think I would have to know a lot more about the specific group to know whether I think like you can just go for it and like do straight up consensus or not. I think what good old fashioned 100% everybody's got to give their consent to a proposal does is it really pushes you to have to listen to each other. I'm a big fan of consensus in the sort of old school way of thinking about it, because I think it pushes you to have to learn the culture better and faster, where if you're doing like consensus -1 or like super majority stuff, like at some point you can stop listening and you can stop trying to have it work for everybody in the group, and you can have somebody become sort of like the sacrificial lamb in the conversation. And I don't think that's the culture that we want to be creating. And so, so I don't have a 100% cheerleading thing or a 100% detractor thing with any of these other kind of modified systems. I think it really depends on who your group is, but get the culture right first is kind of always going to be where I'm going to go back to.
So perhaps a little bit about the culture too. Can you talk a bit about the cultural component that well, yes. Why don't we just go with that one?
Just go with that. Okay,
Sorry,
great.
my chat skipped, but can you talk a little bit more about the cultural component you mentioned earlier?
Okay, and so I meant suggestions about how to get the culture right. Yeah. I mean, I think the number one thing, and this is going to sound a little bit flip, but the number one thing about getting the culture right is assuming that our first instincts most of the time is going to be getting it wrong, because that's how we've been trained in order, to be like, if you think about it, like once you get past kindergarten in our public school system, what you're basically being trained in every year after that, all the way up through getting a PhD, if you go all the way through that, is how to be an effective competitor in the job market. Like that's really a lot of what our schools are geared toward. And so that is our many, 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 many years of training. And so we bring that in, and a lot of times we get things wrong when we just do what we're sort of used to doing. And so, pausing to actually do some like deep listening with each other is a really important thing. Like I think there's some really great programs out there, like everything from like nonviolent communication to restorative circles. Like a lot of different programs are really focused on like teaching you how to listen and to actually get what's going on with the other person or the other people in the room, rather than just staying sort of in our own little bubble and deflecting things that are different perspectives from ours. And so I think there's a lot of systems out there that can help people practice these skills. I'd also say, go ahead, take a screenshot of this chart on the website and just like start playing with it and, seeing what you can come up with and seeing like, where is our group already pretty good at this stuff? Where is our group sucking at this stuff right now? And where do we need to get better? So I think it's a really big thing. And I think also recognizing that you are doing culture change and social change work anytime you try to do something cooperative right now, because it's a different lens that's required to do it. And so I think that recognition that like, this is huge, you're going to mess it up and you're going to be in this for the rest of your life, figuring out how to do this. And then just like relaxing and having a lot of compassion and empathy with each other as you bump into problems and as you don't get it right. It's okay to not get it right all the time.
So there are a couple different versions of the question about how to get the culture and the cooperation right from the start.
Right.
Any words of wisdom?
Yeah. I mean, start with that assumption that you're gonna be needing to learn how to do a different culture, and that sounds excessively simplistic and a little bit circular, but I think the biggest mistakes that I see founders make with groups is not getting it, that there's this huge cultural component to what we're doing. You know, we think about the buildings and we think about the financing, and we don't necessarily think about the social stuff. And I think like folks that are tuning into these little mini webinars, you're here because you get it, that that's a thing. But I think that that's different than like laying it out from the beginning with your group of like, we're going to need to get training. We're going to need to really learn how to work together differently. And we're not going to be able to just default here, and like having that be like constantly in your awareness as a group is probably the best advice that I can give. I'm also working on, and somebody finally talked me into like doing a pretty big web series that's going to be, I'm hoping, out in early December, that is going to be breaking down this chart and actually like going through it and offering exercises and resources for each line in the chart. So if folks are interested, I'm hoping that's out sometime in December, and that would be a much more thorough answer.
So there's a question here, a question about process to create community group values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so groups actually don't usually have a problem with like creating, like coming up with ideas for group values. One of the things that I see groups do a lot of times though is that there's certain buzzwords that almost every group puts into their mission statements that actually don't mean much until you get more specific with it. So like some of those words are sustainable, affordable, accessible, safety, community is one of those that like, we're going to create community. It's like, well, that could mean many, many, many different things to many different people. And the same with all of those other words that I've talked about. And so check and make sure that you're using the language in at least similar enough ways that they're actually going to be meaningful for you. Because I've definitely seen groups that like, they've been living together for 5 years and suddenly somebody says, well, of course we're going to do X, it's in our value system. And other people are like, that's not what I thought that word meant. And you're already invested, you're already living together, and you were not very clear about what some of those words meant. So I think like, you know, you can do brainstorming, and then once you're done with the brainstorming, like get really clear about what some of these words mean. That could mean lots of different things to different people. Diversity is another one that means really different things to different people. So get clear about those.
So he has that was David's question, and he has a little bit more clarification. It seems that it's kind of a chicken or an egg situation. For example, that consensus to agree on values to develop a structure that supports what we want by way of consensus.
Right. It's total chicken and egg. I mean, starting any kind of organization, there's always this chicken and egg stuff going on. And so I tend to think like agree how you're going to make decisions as like the first thing. And that's actually a values question. You know, the choice to do consensus versus voting, like that's actually a values question. And so you start there, and then, you know, work with typically a smaller group of people. I tell groups that I think the sweet spot for a founding group is about 5 to 8 people, and get clear about what your values are and your basic mission is with a group that size, and then open it up and explicitly recruit based on your understanding of what those values are. Now that doesn't help the groups that have been around for a while, but that's the advice for, you know, starting groups, is to like start with a small group where you're small enough that you can actually get consensus on something when you're not very well practiced with it, and then recruit people in based on what those values are that smaller group of people has come up with. And then you're going to get people who are a better match too, you know, who aren't just like, oh, a community, great. It's like, that could mean many, many, many different things. So, you know, get clear enough to be able to bring other people in.
There's a question here. Is it an aspect of consensus that once a decision has been made, it is forever, or how do we change a consensed upon decision?
Yeah, God, I hope not. I mean, I think that's I think that's one of the fears that people have, right? That you're going to get stuck with things forever. You know, the standard that one of my mentors, Laird Shaw, uses basically is like, if there's new information or something significant has changed, it's totally fine to reopen a decision. you know, if nothing's really changed, you don't want to have to like keep litigating the same conversations over and over again. But if there is new stuff that's happening, then it's a good idea to be willing to revisit your decisions. And, you know, and yes, you have to consent upon, you know, those changes, but you had to consent upon the original thing in the first place. And so, you know, consenting upon changes is often easier than consenting to throw something completely out. There's also no reason why you can't do sunset clauses on things, like particularly if it's an experimental thing. And, you know, one of the phrases out of the sociocracy world that I really like is this idea that it's, you know, good enough for now, safe enough to try. And if you're going to take that perspective on things, then you want to pair that, like the sociocracy folks do, with some kind of a sunset clause. And it's like, so we're going to try this experiment for a year. And then at this time next year, we need to reconsent to keeping this if we think it worked well enough. And I think that that's totally fine to do. And I don't think that invalidates it or makes it not a consensus decision. I also see a lot of groups that, like, at about the 15 to 20 year mark, they need a serious refresher on core stuff. You know, unless you've really done a good job of keeping your group values and basic decisions alive, that's a good point somewhere in there to actually go, okay, let's have like a major retreat and really look at, do our original decisions still make sense to us or not? And so I think there's multiple ways to like use time as an arbiter for when you bring something back. But again, if something major has changed, like, you should reopen decisions at that point.
And so a part of that, just a moment ago, you said something about 5 to 8 being kind of the magic number to start with the core group. So somebody's question was, does that small group run the risk of creating a clique? And then later, can new stuff include new members coming into the community and an opportunity to relearn and revisit agreement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you always run the risks of cliques. I mean, that's part of our American training is in-group, out-group. You know, we're in, you're out, we're the top dogs, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that is part of the cultural work, is learning how to take into account not just what's important to you and your immediate group of friends, but to really be listening for what's the best thing for the whole. And so that is a fundamental part of the cultural work that I'm suggesting groups need to do. And you're always going to have founder or early member dynamics with the rest of the group. That's unavoidable. And I think going into it with your eyes really open about, like, almost every group ends up with, you know, some degree of having to deliberately head off that in-group, out-group stuff. And, you know, it's part of why I emphasize, like, make sure people are getting trained in how your decisions are being made, because if you don't do that, you will have an in-group. And I think if you get clear enough about what your values are and what your purpose is as a group, and you're recruiting people explicitly based on those values and that purpose, then that's going to go a long way to like mitigate some of those dynamics. You are more likely to get cliques when you're not clear about what your values are, because there's going to be these people who had some shared understanding and bonding originally, and then people who were brought in who were fuzzy about what they were being brought into and maybe not be in that level of alignment. And so the more clear you can be, the less like.
I like that phrase. What, safe enough for now, good enough to try? Is that what it was?
Yeah, good enough for now, safe enough to try.
Good enough for now. I like that.
Yeah. I'm not a big proponent of sociocracy, but I think they've gotten a few things really, really, really right. And that phrase is spot on. I think it's really good.
Let's see. A question about facilitation teams. Can you comment on facilitation teams?
Meaning a committee of facilitators, or meaning like co-facilitation of a meeting? A committee. I think it's a good idea. I mean, I think that facilitation is it's a high-level skill when people do it really well. And I think having a team of folks that you can, so say I facilitate a meeting and then having a team that I can go back to who will debrief that meeting and give me feedback on how I did, what I did well, what I didn't do so well, that kind of stuff, I think is really important. And it also means if you have a team of people who are working on consciously building their skills as facilitators, then you've got choices. And you've got, you know, folks that are paying attention to who's good at what and who's struggling with whatever it is that they're struggling with in their own learning. And that data about who's good at what will help you be able to choose facilitators carefully and appropriately. And I think having a committee of facilitators, I think, is a really good idea. So, oh, now there's a ton of questions.
Yeah, I think we're up at, before we lose them on our screen, what's your view of proxies, and do they have a place in the consensus process?
So here's the thing. The magic of a consensus decision is that we get together and we start talking about stuff and we listen to each other. And as we're listening, we're changing. Like, we're shifting how we're seeing the thing. We're getting a bigger perspective. You know, sometimes we completely reverse how we feel about something. And I think that magic gets lost when you have people phoning it in, so to speak. You know, when somebody's like, oh, well, this person can just be my person for this thing. Or, you know, sometimes proxies mean somebody's giving their thumbs up or their thumbs down and they're not going to show up to the meeting. I absolutely think you shouldn't let people do that second version of it. But I want people actively engaged in stuff. Now, you know, if somebody's like going out of the country for 6 months or something, then maybe it's okay to have somebody do a proxy, but I think you'd want to be really careful about, you know, not letting people have full access to decision making if they're not going to be full participants in decision making. The rights and responsibilities of showing up in decision making should be paired pretty closely together, and proxies, if you use them a lot, are going to start to undermine that at some point. So I would say use very sparingly is the bottom line for me with proxies.
And what about straw polls?
I mean, I think straw polls are super helpful and interesting as long as you're not having them be binding. You know, it's not like what you're doing is trying to see if you can get consensus in 3 minutes and then get out without actually having to talk about anything. Like, yeah, that's not a great use of straw polls. But I think if you're trying to get a sense of like, well, we're not really sure what direction to go in with this, let's just sort of check where people are at right now, I think those are totally fine to do. So again, it's, you know, it's one of those things where it's a tool and it's useful, and, you know, don't use it constantly, but use it when it seems like it's actually going to help you move the thing forward.
There's a few people asking about kind of what's the difference or differences between consensus and sociocracy, and a few people are curious as to what it is you don't particularly like about the sociocracy process.
Okay, so these are two big can of worms here. So
you have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So in my mind, and, you know, and I've had this conversation with multiple folks who are sociocracy trainers, I think that sociocracy is a way of doing consensus. It's a, you know, it's a particular, and it's also an organizational structure piece that's a big part of sociocracy. And I think that, yeah, so it's a high structure way of doing consensus, and it does some things that I generally disrecommend. I mean, it does tend to say, bring us a proposal. It uses go-arounds, which are one of those things that I consider to be an incredibly useful tool, but not for everything. And that sociocracy's default is doing quick rounds of go-arounds. And so I think that sociocracy is brilliant for what it was designed for, which was originally trying to figure out a way to adapt consensus into a business environment. And if you're in a business environment where you're not dealing with the kind of like intimacy that you get into in community, I think it's a fine adaptation. I also think it's a really good adaptation if you have a really big group that has a complex batch of committees.
How do you balance between exploring issues through consensus versus community members checking out because things get dragged out too long for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is that discernment piece that I was talking about. I mean, there is such a thing as too much talking about something and too much processing. And I do think that there are things that you can do to break it up so you're not doing all of your processing on a particular topic as a full group. Like, I think there's times when like subgroups can work on things, and there's times when, you know, the key players can be put into a fishbowl, you know, where it's like you're in a meeting, you know, I picture it in a circle because that's how most of my groups do meetings. You know, you're in a circle and there's 5 people in the center and they're having the hard conversation and everybody else is listening and sort of getting brought along by those folks shifting and listening to each other. I think there's also a lot that you can do with formats. Like, I work a lot with spectrum exercises in my facilitation work, where you have you create an imaginary line on the floor, and one side of that line you designate as one end of a spectrum or one perspective on what you should do with something, and the other end is another one, and you ask people to line themselves up, and you can spend 3 hours doing go-arounds and having extensive conversation to get out where people are at with something, or you can stick them on a line and get it in 3 minutes. And so I think getting savvy about mixing up your formats as a facilitator is part of what can break some of those conversations up and not have them like drag out forever. And at some point, you know, you may also come to the conclusion as a community that you're not ready to make a decision on something and that the group needs more time. And, you know, I've had that happen with groups that I've been a part of, and we've literally tabled something for 1.5 years and done a bunch of work on a thing and come back to it, and then had a very easy time making a decision because the group was just literally not ready to do a thing. Mm-hmm. And so this is another place where having good facilitators can really help, like, have that discernment about, like, okay, when are we either done talking about this today, or maybe we need to stop talking about this for a while and do some other work as a group. So discernment, discernment, discernment.
So once you've worked so hard to create that culture, how do you pass that on to new people as they join the community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the groups that do the best long-term are ones that have a series of kind of like trainings and orientations that folks are given as they come into the community. Like, sometime in the first 6 months of your community, you should get trained on the decision making. You should get trained on the whatever the conflict resolution model is that you're working on. You should get really thoroughly oriented in, like, here's our values and here's why. And really work on passing that along. And at some point, a group will get to the point where the culture that they're operating out of becomes its own training. And so people come in, they just get that, oh, we do things really differently here. And at some point, some of it becomes more passive. You know, it's a good thing about culture is that it's held by the group to some extent. Like, individuals hold some of it, but the group also holds a chunk of it. And so, you know, it won't be forever that you'll have to be like doing extensive talking at people about stuff. At some point, it'll kind of take on a life of its own if you're doing it well. You know, but it takes a long time to get there. Probably takes about a decade to get to the point where it takes on a life of its own. But at that point, then, you know, the culture is running itself up to a certain point, as long as you're maintaining it and continuing to get training and continuing to, like, you know, be true to it as best you can as a group. So, not sure that was the most clear answer, but yeah, training. Training.
There's been some really great questions. I'm just wondering, as we have just a few minutes here to wrap up, is there anything in particular that you want to just really kind of hit home?
Oh gosh. Yeah, if groups are serious about doing consensus, I would really encourage folks to get training in it. Like, I think groups come in there like, oh, well, this is going to be easy because we care about each other, you know, we're in this together, we all really want this. And it's like, all of that helps, but it's not necessarily enough when we're fighting against that kind of cultural training. And there are really good consensus trainers all over the country. I mean, I'm happy to like help people find folks who are local to them, you know, to be able to do that. But I think groups underestimate, you know, what a shift it's going to be to actually move from voting. And, you know, you can see how nasty voting systems can get sometimes if you look around the world, and you know, and that we don't want to be bringing that stuff in to, you know, into our groups. So yeah, just get training, get training, get training. That's the thing I would hammer home. And love each other through it, you know.
I think we'll take this last question, and then I'm assuming if anybody has any follow-up questions, they can shoot you an email, and your website has a ton of information. I'll plug in the link here. The question is, when you speak of discernment, who provides that? Like, do you advise having a team to set the agenda and the process for meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's lots of different layers of discernment. I do think that there should be a clear way that things get on the agenda, and that somebody or someone should be kind of the gatekeepers for that, and that you want to choose those people carefully so that they're people that are trusted and that generally are even-handed about things. You know, I think that discernment is something that is going to show up in every aspect of your community life if you're doing this cooperative culture thing well. So some of that, like as a group, getting good at knowing when to stop talking about something, you know, that's a form of discernment. I think, you know, being okay with saying that, like, a person who's been, you know, say a permaculture trainer for 20 years probably has better input than somebody who just grew their first turnip, you know, and that's okay to say we're going to actually lean into the expert advice that we have. You know, that's a form of discernment. I think it's going to show up in lots of different places, and ultimately it's the full group's responsibility, and you can create systems like having agenda planners to reinforce that stuff. But, you know, I really want everybody in the group to be, you know, thinking about balancing those two things, discernment and compassion, and that's everybody's job, ultimately, if you want a group that's really functional.
And training.
Training.
Okay, good. All right, well, we have 1 minute. I have 1 minute to say what I need to say. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge, and I really appreciate all the attendees being here tonight and chiming in with your questions. That definitely just helps us all learn. So this web chat series is a free offering by Coho US, but it does take some staff time to kind of put it all together and find the professionals and all that sort of thing. So feel free to donate to Coho US. Feedback is very welcome as well, and I will plug in Karen's email address, because Karen Gimnig is really the brainchild, if you will, of this whole web chats series. So if you have feedback or suggestions on speakers, please let her know. The next web chat is Wednesday, November 14th, 4:30 Pacific, 5:30 Mountain, 6:30 Central, 7:30 Eastern. This information is on the website. And it's Ted Rao speaking on keeping meetings short. He's got a good sense of humor, so I'm sure there will be some great stuff.
And Ted's great. Have fun with Ted.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.